Hello and welcome to Harry Cole Saves the West, the show where American grit meets British backbone. Tonight, we're talking China. It's a looming catastrophe and the West is sleepwalking into it. China isn't a challenge, it's an enemy. Beijing wants dominance over the West. Military, tech, economic, total. And it's getting there fast. In Britain, 2 men were accused of spying for the communists. Penetrating the very heart of the British establishment, one of them even worked in Parliament. But the case against them collapsed because a spineless government wouldn't dare call Beijing an enemy in court. Now an almighty blame game is underway. Labour blame the Tories, prosecutors blame Labour, and a Prime Minister has the stench of geopolitical scandal wafting around him. Tonight, we speak exclusively to a man at the very centre of this story. Joining me live from Washington, D.C. is former British Security Minister Tom Tugendhat. Mr Tugendhat, good evening.
Good evening, Harry.
At the very centre of this scandal is a man that you worked closely with, who was accused of passing secrets to Beijing. Now, the trial against him has collapsed. To bring our listeners and viewers who don't know the intricate details of it up to speed, and then we'll get into whose fault it was.
So, let's start off. I set up the China Research Group in April 2020, and that was to understand, exactly as you're setting out, the challenge that China is posing, because let's face it, it's not an ordinary challenge. This isn't some sort of economic competition. This is much, much deeper. And so we set it up so that people could understand what China was actually doing.
A group of like-minded lawmakers.
A group of like-minded MPs. Yep. I set it up with Neil O'Brien, a fantastic colleague, and various other people joined. We hired a researcher initially, a very active young woman who ran a fantastic team. And one of the people who came in a few months, maybe about a year later, was Chris Cash. Now, I handed it over at a certain point. I can't remember exactly.
When you were appointed the Minister of Security in the government.
Exactly right. And so couldn't obviously have outside government offices like that. I handed it over. Alicia Kearns took over the organisation. And Chris Cash ended up as the director. Now, what's stunned me, frankly, was when I was Security Minister and I was briefed that an arrest was being made of somebody, Chris Cash, who had worked in Parliament, who had worked for this organisation.
You had access to the very heart of the British government. The people you were talking about are senior politicians, senior MPs, and he had unfettered access to Parliament and their offices.
So he absolutely had access to Parliament. He didn't have access to any secrets because, of course, Parliament doesn't hold secrets. But as many people have pointed out in the past, and I will say again now, if you want to find a needle in a haystack, first of all, you need a haystack. You need that kind of information around it. Now, we were given evidence at the time that pointed very clearly to the connection between Chris Cash, another individual called Chris Berry, and links back to the Chinese Communist Party. The counter-terror police, who in the UK are responsible for this sort of action, then conducted an arrest, and we were told very clearly that the arrest was not only entirely legal in the sense that they had proof of it, but they were very confident of a prosecution. Clearly they had to be confident to arrest somebody who's been working in Parliament in this level, to arrest somebody who's connected to so many MPs. The police were very careful.
So the case against him, in the views of the prosecutors, they have said publicly, they remain incredibly strong. Now, fast forward to a couple of weeks ago, the case collapses.
Right.
Because, and this is where it gets murky, it's alleged that the government refused to provide evidence, written evidence, to the court that branded China a threat. Now, this has been a row in the UK for, I've been writing about it for years before I moved out here. Would successive prime ministers brand, like the United States does, China a strategic threat to our national security, a threat to Britain? They woolly around it and call it a challenge and things like that. Now, the Tory government that you served in did not officially designate.
Well, hang on.
But let's just explain to the readers, to the listeners, did not officially designate China a threat, is what is claimed now. And therefore, the current Labour administration say, well, because at the time of these offences were alleged to have taken place, because the Tories did not do that, despite a big row about whether they should or not, that meant the evidence was not significant enough to prosecute these 2 gentlemen. No, I call them gentlemen. We'll see about that. Jury's out on that one. Now, there's a phenomenal blame game going on, which you are at the heart of that. The Prime Minister directly blames your government, your administration for failing to just be tough enough on China, which has allowed these two to allegedly wriggle off. What is your response to that?
So I think that's a pretty extraordinary statement, because what he's actually saying, he's not actually blaming us. He's blaming the intelligence services and the police. He's saying that they didn't understand the prosecution they were bringing. They didn't understand the case that they were making, and that therefore they made an unsubstantiated arrest. Now that's a very extraordinary thing to say, because it is absolutely clear, not only from when I was chair of the Foreign Affairs Committee and I published reports on this, but when I was in government in April 24, I answered a question in Parliament from the dispatch box, which, as you know, means that it is by definition government policy, stating very clearly that China was a principal national security threat. Not only that, you've seen the integrated review, our defence review, published in March 2023, that uses the words national security threat.
But then that was then rewritten by the Labour. Let's look at some of the things the government have said. So Richard Moore, former head of MI6, in November 2021, describes China as the biggest of four big threats facing Britain, alongside Russia, Iran, and international terrorism. So there's that word threat. Now, Ken McCallum, the head of MI5, the Internal Security Services, said in November 2022, right when these guys are accused of spying in Parliament, he would say the activities of the Chinese Communist Party pose the most game-changing strategic challenge to the UK. The word threat isn't there. But the government statement, an anonymous government statement in September 2023, said that China poses a national security threat. What I've been looking for in my research all day today is someone on the record saying the words national security threat from a Tory's mouth. I cannot find it. Am I wrong?
I can give it to you. April 2024, in Hansard. You can get it on the clips from the Parliament Live website. I say it from the dispatch box completely clearly.
And do you believe that was enough to hold up a prosecution in court?
So not only do I believe it's enough, which you can argue with me if you wish, but Simon Case, the former cabinet secretary, the head
who has spoken out tonight and said the evidence was there.
And Jonathan Hall, Casey, who is the review of
terrorism legislation.
Exactly right. One of the most senior counter-terror, counter-espionage lawyers in the government, still serving in the government, but not directly. He's got a slightly independent status. And he has spoken out and said, this doesn't make sense. He's been very clear that the evidence stacks up.
Do you wish you'd gone further, though? Do you wish the government had designated officially China as a threat? There was a big row about it. There was, people
which side of the argument I was on that. I wanted it designated as a threat.
So your previous administration, the administration that you served in, could have gone further.
Look, of course,
and harder.
Of course that's true, and I don't argue that at all. But the defence that the Labour administration are putting up now is total rubbish. This isn't one of those things where, this isn't like declaring war or not declaring war. This isn't a designation like that. This is about a body of evidence. Now, don't take my word for it. Take it from the appeal court. The appeal court of England and Wales had a trial only 2 years ago, in 2023, where some Bulgarians were accused and eventually convicted of spying for Russia. Now, the appeal court judge there looked at the Official Secrets Act, which is an old law, it's from 1911, and looked at the reading of it. And it says, assisting an enemy. Now, he looked at that and said, well, you haven't described Russia as an enemy, so can we do it? And that was the defence for the Bulgarians. Now, actually, the appeal court said, yes, you can. In reality, what the judge did was he lowered the bar. He said, you don't have to use the specific word. You have to demonstrate that they are a threat. Well, there is a pattern of evidence demonstrating that.
The Chief Prosecutor, Crown Prosecution Service, a body that Keir Starmer once headed up in a past life before he was Prime Minister, they seem to be suggesting that they had been spending almost a year asking the government to go further, which would imply that what the government currently has and the previous government had done wasn't quite enough. They wanted it in explicit terms, in writing, that China is an enemy. They didn't get that. They didn't get it from the Tories.
I'm going to pick you up on that, actually. I'm going to pick you up on that. What they were waiting for was for the witness to come forward for the court. Now, we had prepared. We had done all the work ready for that. Then the election came, as you know.
Yep.
So
you guys lost.
You
guys came in.
So we couldn't put up the witness. There's nothing that I can do. I'm not a minister anymore. I can't put up the witness. All I can tell you is that the work was done. Simon Case confirms that the work was done. Everybody in authority or in influence at the time confirms that the work was done, it is a political decision now to say that a civil servant can't give that evidence. That is a political decision of today, not of yesterday.
A political and perhaps an economic decision, which we're going to get into a moment. But the centering now is around the National Security Advisor, a gentleman called Jonathan Powell, who it's alleged had a hand in stopping short and arguing that China should not be called an enemy by the British government in court to protect, it is alleged, Britain's economic and diplomatic ties with the Beijing communist regime. You are a man incredibly plugged into the national security world. You served as a security minister. You've had a long, distinguished career in the armed forces. Do you think that's, Jonathan Powell is a career diplomat, feted for bringing peace to Northern Ireland. He is intimately involved in the Ukraine efforts at peace. Do you really believe that such a person would willingly and knowingly risk collapsing this trial?
Let me put it this way. Jonathan Powell is a special advisor. You don't blame special advisors for ministerial decisions. You blame the minister. In this case, the special advisor works for the Prime Minister. Doesn't work for any other minister, works for the Prime Minister. So this is a decision taken in some way by Number 10. I don't know who, I couldn't tell you exactly who. I'm not in Number 10. But they work to the Prime Minister. And because of the decisions taken in some way to change the way in which they're willing to present the case, you look at the words of the Director of Public Prosecutions. He says specifically that the evidence is no longer meets the threshold. Now, the fact that he says no longer means it did, now it doesn't. Something has changed. Now, I don't know what's changed, but I tell you what, somebody in Number 10 does know what's changed, and they're not being straight with us.
How does this play out? Is this another great, spectacular British cock-up that will be swept under the carpet? We'll all move on, and carry on buying cheap Chinese tat and being entirely reliant on their electric cars and their solar panels and their chips, and we'll all just pretend this never happened because you know what, we need them.
Well, that's why I'm talking to you tonight. Because it is simply unacceptable to brush this under the carpet. This is a very, very clear decision. Do you believe in parliamentary freedom? Do you believe that the British people have the right to choose their own members of parliament, those who represent them? Do you believe that those representatives have the right to speak freely, without influence, without pressure from foreign states? Or do you believe that we should cover up that influence? Now, I think that we should stand up for the British people, and there's a real question here as to whose side they're on.
Wow, I mean, that is big language. You are basically accusing the British government, Number 10, Sir Keir Starmer's administration, of siding with the Beijing regime over Britain.
No, I'm accusing them of siding with transitory economic advantage over the fundamental interests of the British people.
Politician's answer, if I ever.
Well, it's true, isn't it?
But make the accusation if you're actually saying it. You're saying they collapsed this trial. They didn't provide the evidence because they wanted to protect economic relations with Beijing.
Well, that's what it looks like. I can't tell you what the internal reason was because I am not in this administration, so I can't tell you the specific reason. All I can tell you is this trial has collapsed for reasons that are completely obscure. Don't take my word for it. Look at what the former Cabinet Secretary said. Look at what the Reviewer of Terror says. Look at what every leading lawyer, there's a series of Twitter threads by leading lawyers in the United Kingdom, all of them saying the same thing. This doesn't make sense. Now, what has changed? We've seen many, many different ministers going to Beijing recently. We've seen various people having meetings at the highest level in China recently. Is this part of a deal? I don't know.
It's clear.
But it raises questions.
It's clear that this administration, despite the slightly lily-livered nature of relations with the Chinese under the Tories at various guises, let's not forget, David Cameron, George Osborne were hailing the golden era not long ago of Chinese relationships at the beginning of the Tories administration.
And as you know, I called it out.
It did, indeed, and it's now widely known in Whitehall as the golden era. But I mean, the Tories' hands aren't entirely clean on this one. But for the sake of argument, let's take your point in the fact the Labour administration came in July 2024, immediately softened the tone. Rachel Reeves, the Chancellor, was out to Beijing. They have talked openly and privately about the fact that this government needs growth in order to function. So that pursuit of growth appears to be being put over the pursuit of justice here? Is that the central tenet?
Well, that's what it feels like, right? That is exactly
And you
what it
think
feels
there's
like.
a political decision made by the Prime Minister and perhaps the National Security Advisor and perhaps other elements of the, the so-called deep state and the Treasury, example. How deep do you think this goes?
Harry, let me be very clear. When I left office in July 24, there was a dossier of evidence ready to go, ready to be presented by a senior civil servant in court, demonstrating clearly, beyond doubt, that China was a threat to the UK's national security. It included evidence like the overseas police stations that you know about that have been reported. It included evidence like the harassment of Hong Kongers, British nationals who came from Hong Kong, in the United Kingdom. It included evidence of industrial espionage, and in fact, it even included evidence of China hacking the Ministry of Defence. We have got this in black and white.
So there's somewhere in Whitehall that dossier is still sitting there that would be more than enough to, brand China an enemy.
The appeal court judge asked for evidence in the Russia case that Russia presented a national security threat. Not that it had been defined or designated. These are labels that are meaningless.
Yeah.
They just wanted the evidence that it was so. We had that dossier, it was ready. I have no idea what the Labour government have done with it, but frankly, they are refusing to put up a civil servant, a senior official, to make that case in court, and that's why this trial has collapsed.
And in your view, the responsibility of that lies entirely with the Prime Minister?
Well, it's clearly a political decision. This is his government, it's his responsibility.
All right, so look, you don't accept, you've made your case eloquently on that front. Let's go back to that, to the basics of this. This is a spectacular failure, of British security, of parliamentary security, did you ever, when this young man, tell me about the young man that joined your team, you joined your research group, he helped you out. At any point did you not think, hang on, this guy's asking too many questions. This guy perhaps, I remember the time, because there was a big split at the time between the sort of the Tory MPs who were very heavy on China and the Tory MPs who wanted to be a bit softer, and then there were splits between the Hawks and the Doves, internal splits within the Hawks. And this Cash gentleman appears to have been meddling and playing around in both sides. At any point did you go, hang on, who the hell is this guy?
So, first of all, he was an intern. He wasn't somebody who worked in the office.
He was an intern, and then he was a researcher, and then he was the director of the group that you founded.
But for me, he was one thing. He was an intern. So he didn't work in my office. He didn't have access to my office.
Did you give him a parliamentary pass?
No, he didn't have access to my office.
When did he achieve that?
That would have been later. So presumably when.
So when you went into government, and then another MP took over the group, Alicia Kearns, and she gave him a parliamentary pass.
That's my understanding.
And there was no background checks that flagged anything suspicious?
Well, in order to get a parliamentary pass, you have to, as you know, you have to submit various...
They seem to be more concerned about rooting out Irish terrorism with people's Irish parents than that's the only thing you have to declare, as far as I can recall.
I can't remember what the declaration.
It's not exactly the heftiest of
no,
crackdowns,
it's not. But don't forget, you don't have access to secret information.
Well, Alicia Kearns was chairman of the Foreign Affairs Select Committee. She's briefed by the security services in private. I know you and I both know what MPs' offices can be like. There is, officially nothing that says official or sensitive or secret on it, but information in that building does flow round. This guy, the communists, if this is true, we don't know now because he's not going to be put on trial, but we are slightly protected here by the First Amendment. They played a blinder with this guy, right?
Well, if it is true, and according to British law, according to American law as well, he's innocent unless proven guilty. He's not been proven guilty. What we need to know is what on earth went on. Where did the recruitment happen, if it happened? What was the evidence that was being handed over? What was the information that was being handed over? There's a huge amount of rumour going around, and frankly, we need to have that in court. That's why we need a trial. That's why we need to have this evidence out there.
So your conscience is clear that this was, an inadverted error. This guy, you've been played, right?
I've been targeted. What you're arguing correctly is that the effect I was having on the Chinese government was such that they were willing to try to put resources against me. Well, frankly, on one level that's flattering. It's also a very deep betrayal, and you can hear, I hope, I'm absolutely furious about this. This is a direct attack on the rights of British people to choose their members of parliament, and for those members of parliament to be able to argue cases in favour of the British people without influence.
And for our audience who are not aware of the people, these gentlemen are now I keep calling them gentlemen, we're still not sure about that one yet. These accused are currently roaming the streets of Britain.
Well, they're not accused anymore. They're not even accused anymore.
What happens next? You've read my mind for my next question. What happens next? Can you bring a private prosecution? Could there be grounds for a retrial? What happens next? What parliamentary pressure will you and your colleague, you're still in the Houses of Parliament, what pressure, how do you stop this one, as we discussed, just being swept under the carpet?
Well, as you know, the Speaker, Sir Lindsay Hoyle,
is boiling with rage.
He is absolutely incandescent. He shares our fury at this, because this is a direct assault on the institution, on the liberties that he's promised to protect as Speaker of the House. So he is furious. He is absolutely incandescent. So we're absolutely talking to him about what parliamentary pressure we can bring, what kind of action we can bring. Other people have spoken about private prosecutions. I don't know whether that's credible or not. I haven't taken legal advice on it. But it is certainly true that there is a series of errors that have got us to a position where the government, frankly, has let the British people down and has let Parliament down, and that is simply unacceptable.
Would you like to see heads roll? Obviously not your own or anyone from your administration, it seems, but do you think there is a case for Labour advisors, security advisors, officials, ministers?
Well, let's just be quite clear. The moment any evidence of this came to us, we hit it as hard and as clearly and with all the authority of the state to take action. Our actions were interrupted by an election. The British people chose a different administration. And at that point, our power stopped. But everything was done and ready to go for a prosecution. Again, don't take my word for it. Neutral civil servants like Simon Case and Jonathan Hall have made that case. They have stated it. So this isn't a political point. This is a point about who governs Britain and how.
And to be clear, as we've just said, you believe that rests with the Prime Minister?
The Prime Minister leads this administration. The Prime Minister is responsible for its special advisors.
I remember Keir Starmer, call me old-fashioned, I remember Keir Starmer, sort of leading the prosecution charge over whether a Prime Minister ate a slice of birthday cake. Or, Mr. Rules, he used to call himself. And this, from where I'm sitting, looking back at my homeland from 5,000 miles away, this strikes me as a massive, spectacular scandal that seems not to be being played out in the way that, the state broadcaster and vast swathes of the media leapt on far, far, far smaller stories.
Well, I think it's growing, frankly, and I take your point entirely. The idea that this is in any way comparable with, cake and COVID is ridiculous.
This is
really
a political
serious
scandal that's essentially saying the British government, because of their relationship with Beijing, have allowed justice to be bent, essentially.
We know that the Chinese aren't trading with us because they like us or because we're being nice to them. They're trading with us because they need trade, right? Trade isn't some sort of global gift. It's what everybody needs in order for prosperity to happen. The Chinese need it too. The idea that we should be sacrificing our liberties so that we can enrich China is utter rubbish.
I mean, look at the response from Donald Trump to China. He said it's the number one political threat, strategic threat, that word, to the United States. He slapped, I don't know where the tariffs are. At one point they were up to 138%, then they were 50%. But, he's made his views on China very clear. He was very clear in his first administration on pinning the source of COVID directly at Beijing's door, when the rest of the world still had their hands over their eyes and their fingers in their ears. America would not put up with this sort of behaviour.
No,
right?
well,
we look, as a country, the United Kingdom looks ridiculous.
Well, I'm afraid I agree with you, but you'll remember when COVID happened, I was one of the few who said, this has come out of China, this is a lab leak. I was harangued for it, but the Mail, your old paper...
One of them.
Forgive me, but yes, they did work for somebody else before, published pieces that I wrote at the time making that case. This is about a geostrategic threat that has been rising over the last 15, 20 years, and that you have correctly described as all-encompassing. Look, we are seeing the national security threat in everything from chips and batteries through to, basic consumer goods and all the rest of it. This is a serious challenge, and we are not taking it seriously. Frankly, nobody has quite got to grips with it yet.
Tom Tugendhat, stay there. We've got author and columnist, I believe, and China expert Gordon Chang joining us now. Good evening, Mr. Chang. I hope you heard, I think you have heard, Mr. Tugendhat's extraordinary interview there with us tonight. Can I get your response to that central claim that a Western power, the United Kingdom, has kowtowed effectively to Chinese trade and Chinese business over justice for alleged Chinese spying. An astonishing story, right?
Astonishing, and clearly that's the way it looks to the outside world, that Britain can be bullied, as the FT just said. Right now, it does appear that Britain is basically weak. And we see this not only in this case, but also this back and forth over the mega embassy. We've just learned about a week ago that the Chinese were turning off the water to the British embassy in Beijing. And what did Britain do? Didn't do anything. And it's still considering the mega embassy. So you put these two things together, and at least from the outside, it does look like Britain is being pushed around, and the Chinese are going to continue to push around. They push around my country, they're pushing around your country, and at some point, we got to grow a backbone.
How does that work, though? I mean, everyone jumps at once, all jump together. The fears and the fears that people every economy is reliant on Chinese imports, from solar panels to chips to even a range of domestic goods. They've got us over the barrel, though, right? There is no way that Britain, America, Europe could just walk away. It's a little bit like with the Russians and their cheap gas and their cheap oil. There'll be a huge economic hit to the West if they did actually stand up for what they believe in.
Yeah, I mean, there would be temporary disruptions. Right now, China has been withholding magnets and rare earth minerals to the United States. They've also got another card to play, which is pharmaceuticals and active pharmaceutical ingredients. But we forget that, as we just heard, China needs us. And certainly, the United States, last year we ran a $294.5 billion merchandise trade deficit with China, which means that we should be using our purchasing power to push the Chinese around, because in trade wars, trade deficit countries hold the cards. But we refuse to see how strong we are. We just look at our weaknesses. So yes, there would be disruptions, but they would be a lot less than China's. China, last year ran a $992.2 billion trade surplus against the world. They really need countries like Britain. They need countries like the United States in order to sell, to keep their economy going.
What sort of message does it send to the also very sophisticated Chinese spying operation that is operating around the world, almost, when we see situations like this in London with impunity? Presumably this is a green light to the Beijing communist regime to carry on cracking on.
Oh, absolutely. I mean, they look at all of these disputes over whether it was declared to be a national security threat, in 1990, whatever. And they just laugh at us because they don't have rule of law. To the extent that they have law, they have rule by law. And they aren't going to let some technicality get in their way of taking somebody off of their streets that they feel that has been engaged in espionage against the Chinese state. So they look at us and they believe that we are weak because we're not defending ourselves. The Chinese know what they're doing, and they can see that we're not protecting ourselves. And it's not just Britain, it's also the United States as well, and other countries. So China will continue to engage in the most destructive of behavior until it is stopped. We have the power to stop it, Harry, but we're not doing it. And the Chinese look at us, they look at the United States. They know that by the metrics, we're a far stronger society than China. But they just look at us as a far weaker society because we're not willing to use our power to protect ourselves.
Gordon Chang, chilling warning there. Thank you very much for joining us on Harry Kell Saves the West. Mr. Tugendhat, you're still with me. Gordon Chang's pretty stark words there. The West is weak and China's laughing at us.
Well, actually, Gordon's point was even more than that. It's the West isn't weak, it's choosing to be weak. That's the key word. This is a political decision. These are political decisions. And consistently, we have seen in decisions like the Chagos Island deal, which, I've been hugely critical of, which is effectively handing over one of the most important strategic air bases to a country that has genuinely no serious claim to it. And various decisions on whether it's deciding to leave our energy in the ground and become dependent on China for batteries and solar and things like that. This is ridiculous. We are literally choosing to leave ourselves weaker against a state that is actually trying to undermine us?
Yes, we are choosing, but economically they do have us over the barrel. This is exactly the point I was trying to make earlier. Exactly the same with vast parts of Europe. Look what happened after the invasion of Ukraine: massive rising energy prices. Which elected politician who needs to rely on being re-elected is going to tell the British public and the American public and the European public that they need to get poorer?
Harry, look, there's a short-term and a long-term question here. The short-term question is, are you willing to have a fight to defend your freedoms and your liberties? Because if you are not, you're going to find out very quickly that the arguments you have over economic power become irrelevant. Now, just look at what happened when David Cameron met the Dalai Lama. The Chinese apparently snubbed him for 2 years afterwards. Trade with China went up. Why? Because China needs trade too.
Tom Tugendhat, thank you for joining us on Harry Cole Saves the West. Don't go anywhere. We're going to be talking a story that's even bigger, perhaps. Even bigger than Watergate, they're saying. We'll be back after this. Welcome back to Harry Cole Saves the West. Now, let's talk about the deep state, that shadowy blob of bureaucrats, spooks and swamp creatures who think they run America, no matter who you vote for. Well, have they finally proved it this week? We've learned that Biden's FBI secretly grabbed the phone records of 8 sitting US senators, so-called Operation Arctic Frost, into the supposed 2020 election meddling. 8 lawmakers spied on by their own government. Veteran Senator Chuck Grassley calls it worse than Watergate. And is he right? Is this oversight or overreach on steroids? Is the deep state finally flexing its muscles too far? Joining us to unpack all that is former FBI Special Agent Ren McEachern. Ren, thanks for joining us. This seems like a phenomenally large scandal that is being somewhat downplayed. We heard before the break about a massive scandal in Britain that's being underplayed. This strikes me as, the government spying on lawmakers on what evidence?
Yeah, I don't think the comparisons to Watergate are really that bombastic. I mean, this is quite exceptional. And when it comes to, information and investigations against sitting senators, there is a very high threshold around DOJ to look at these politically charged subjects in this case. And then what was the probable cause, right, to the grand jury that thought grabbing the toll records of these sitting senators would make sense? Because I know what's going to happen next, right? Once they get those numbers, they're going to do link analysis and figure out who they're talking to and do the spider web and do the analysis and figure out who else can they look at. It's a political dragnet, and it shouldn't just be Republicans or Democrats that should be scared. Everybody should be scared, because if it can happen to them, it can happen to you. It's a huge misjustice and overreach, no question.
And it wasn't just senators as well. I mean, Stephen Miller, the Deputy White House Chief of Staff, has been very vocal today about the fact that, 3 weeks before he went back into the White House in January, Google magically popped up to tell him, oh yeah, by the way, we've been secretly feeding the feds your details. How far does this go? I mean, obviously the 8 lawmakers, the 8 senators, is a line that is crossed. There is precedents in place that politicians are not spied on. How far does this go? Is it beyond the senators and beyond Trump administration officials? This could be pretty devastating, right?
Yeah, I mean, this is just really the beginning, and thank God for the DOJ under Bondi and of course Patel with the FBI, that we wouldn't have known about this if it wasn't for them unearthing these and unclassifying these documents and finding them and saying, wait a minute, the public needs to know. We need to be transparent. I'm worried that this is just the beginning. And thankfully, we're going to find out, because there has to be obviously investigation within the Bureau, but then oversight under Grassley has to take a look at this. And I know they're going to dig deep on this. The community, the country needs transparency on this. Otherwise, the conspiracy theories go crazy, and I'm worried about where this might go.
You worked inside the FBI. You've been on the inside. Can you really imagine, agents? This is what they signed up for to spy on politicians?
Yeah, it would be odd. Of course, doing investigations into politicians is part of their remit for the Bureau and protecting the Constitution, but not this. This is way beyond. Like I said, this is a political dragnet. It's the weaponization of both the agents, the agency, and the law. And that's why it's devastating. And in the way they use it to look at toll records and looking at phones, That's a communication device. They look at IP. Do they look at devices that are attached to those phones, right? Where does this go? I think we're just going to, this is just the beginning. It's like the tip of an iceberg. But it's very curious to have six sitting senators being looked at like this. I can't think of a case like this in FBI history that would be so sweeping in this way and such one-sided from a political lens, if you will.
Donald Trump's obviously very vocal about his desire to see James Comey seek justice. Do you expect to see more of the agency's sort of headline names be brought into this and perhaps be, prosecuted?
Well, I think anytime they make an arrest and an indictment like James Comey, he will likely, I don't know for sure, he might provide information if he's looking to, plead out on a deal. And basically what happens there is then he'll give other people up. I think in the case of the intelligence community, it sounds like there's a lot of smoke. It looks like there's a lot of smoke. And I think, that has to be looked at to see where the fire exists. I think with James Comey, it's just the beginning. I think there's other former members of the intelligence community that have a lot to answer to and look very political into the idea of changing intelligence because they didn't like it, because they didn't fit the narrative, because they didn't think Trump was getting elected. This is what's disturbing. And the power of the intelligence community is beyond what most people can imagine. And it's just it scares me as an American citizen.
Well, I think it would scare any American citizen. Do you think, just final question, that the old Trump derangement syndrome's in play here as well, because it's Kash Patel, Dan Bongino exposing this stuff, because it's the Trump administration exposing this stuff, the sort of media reaction to it has been far, far more muted than it would have been if the boot had been on the other foot. Can you imagine if Donald Trump was accused of spying on six senators? We wouldn't hear the end of this.
This would be the number one story for the next 10 years, right?
Yeah, right.
It's obviously super unfair the way this is reported. And it doesn't matter which side you're on. The documents are going to tell the case. Remember, follow the money. Going back to Watergate.
Yeah.
Follow the documents. The documents will tell the story.
No wonder they were the hum of shredders was roaring around Washington in the run-up to January. Ren, thank you for joining us on Save the West. Come back and see us again soon. Right, hot-footed all the way from the White House, joining us in the studio, the Daily Caller's White House correspondent Reagan Reese and Rebecca Zelko from The Blaze. Both have just made it by the whistle, running down the street to join us. We're going to talk about what was going on at the White House after the break. Fascinating developments on a different front there. But let's talk about the story. Am I going crazy? Surely, imagine, as the point I made there to Ren, if this had been Trump on the other foot, this would just be dominating every network. Where's Jimmy? Where's Jimmy Kimmel?
Well, right now we're hearing all this whining about the DOJ being weaponized against James Comey and how President Trump is manipulating and controlling the DOJ. And meanwhile, we have a story like this. And I say, look to that. Look at the weaponization. Look at the politicization of the DOJ and how it was targeting President Trump's administration. And to say that this is only something that President Trump is doing and he has never been the victim of is unbelievable.
As well, right?
Yes.
Rebecca, listen, where does this go next? I mean, are you expecting to see more? I mean, is this just the tip of the iceberg? What else is Kash Patel and Bongino planning? How wide do you suspect this is going to go?
I mean, that's the question on everyone's mind right now, is how far does this really go? Because if you can violate the privacy of 8 sitting senators just because of their political affiliation is what it seems like. I mean, I would really love to know, I think the American people would love to know, which company has actually complied with this subpoena? Who turned over this information, this sensitive private information, and on what legal standing? And the fact that it can happen to senators means that it could happen to us or anybody else watching.
Journalists, imagine, we'd all, if they're willing to spy on senators, there's no way in hell they're not listening to journalist calls and trying to find sources. Reagan, it does strike me that America's slipped down a path of, sort of prosecuting political opponents once the elections have passed. Obviously, that's the sort of thing we kind of associate with South America and banana republics and things. But Donald Trump kind of does have a point. He's always said they're kind of out to get me, and this is a smoking gun, right?
Yeah, 100%. And I think President Trump and his base are absolutely correct to be so angry about this. And I said this kind of jokingly today, but President Biden admitted that his DOJ was weaponized and politicized. And of course, he was talking about it when it came to his own son. But it was this very funny admission that President Biden made at the end of his term that kind of just proves this whole point that President Trump and his administration have been targeted. And I think, again, his base is so right to be frustrated. And of course, we're never going to hear about it. It's the same way we haven't heard about probably the Antifa roundtable at the White House, probably about Jay Jones. We haven't heard about any of these stories on the mainstream media because they don't care and they're against President Trump and his mission.
There is a spectacular hypocrisy here, right? I mean, presumably this is only going to enliven Donald Trump to put the pedal to the metal in terms of prosecuting. He's basically now got carte blanche to say, well, these guys, look what these guys did. Will we reach a point where everyone kind of steps back and just thinks, actually, let's talk about this, let's try and de-escalate this, let's talk about the actual scandal here. And the fact is the executive branch is clearly, on both sides, able to politicise the FBI like this.
I mean, the point of talking about it, I think, is the most important takeaway here, because as Reagan pointed out, the media is not talking about it. I encourage the audience to look through all of the mainstream publications, look through who's talking about this story at all, and look at how they're framing it. That's a really important point, and that's one that the president mentioned today at this Antifa roundtable. I mean, they really are the culprits to this.
We are going to talk about that Antifa roundtable when we come back after the break. What an episode! Two massive scandals on two sides of the Atlantic, but we might have a little bit of light relief after the break. Antifa and Greta Thunberg. What more could you want? Don't go anywhere. Welcome back to Harry Cole Saves the West. Don't forget to subscribe on YouTube and you won't miss a thing. Harry Cole Saves the West. You want to be there. Right, welcome back. We're still joined in the studio with Rebecca Zelko from The Blaze and White House correspondent from The Daily Caller, Reagan Reese. I knew I was going to get that right. There's always one thing I mess up at the end of this show. Guys, welcome back. You've just come straight from the White House. Reagan, tell us what the president has been doing. It looked quite lively on our favourite lefties, and I've been taught by an American to pronounce this properly, Antifa.
Yes. So the president held a roundtable today on Antifa. He invited a bunch of independent journalists who have been covering these protests, who have been covering Antifa, many of which have been beaten, come face to face with death, or been arrested.
The hard left, militant, and some say terrorist communist organisation that you see them at these rallies in their black helmets and their boiler suits.
Yes.
Right? These guys.
And the president is he's declared them a domestic terror organization. He wants to get to the bottom of who's funding them, what the organization is that is, running Antifa. And what he revealed to us at the end is that they have pretty good knowledge of the organization and funding of Antifa, and that they're actually going to use those journalists there. They're going to ask them for their sources, what they know about the funding and organization of Antifa, to go straight at them, to cut the head off.
In most people's minds, there's sort of, the ragtag protesters who turn up to all sorts of things, but presumably someone is paying them because they don't appear to be going to work anywhere. They appear to be popping up all over the country. Who's paying for the helmets? Was there any inclination of who this might be? Is it domestic? Is it foreign influence?
Not that they revealed there, but some of the journalists were very confident that they knew who was funding Antifa, and we're going to reveal that to the president. And it sounds like he is going to take that with his DOJ. And the president sounded confident that if they do cut off who is funding Antifa, that can be it. That can end Antifa, because a lot of it is, getting that money, that planning to then pop up all over the country.
Rebecca, there's a really interesting way of doing things, right? I mean, bringing in independent journalists and experts and commentators who've watched this slowly. Has there been is that a sort of tacit acceptance that perhaps the state has been sort of caught off guard on this one, and actually it's fallen to the people to actually reveal the truth? And if anything, the government's playing catch up here.
Absolutely, and I have to shout out those journalists there. One of our own from The Blaze, Julio Rosas, he was on that panel, and he's come face to face, as Reagan said, with this violence on a regular basis. And the tricky thing about Antifa is they're organized to an extent, but a lot of it is local. A lot of it's locally organized, and so it's really hard to find exactly where the funding is coming through, which NGOs. Neville Singham is the name that's come up very frequently, but I'm sure that there's countless others. And so it's really that's why it's so difficult to actually crack down on this extremely violent organization. You mentioned that, it might just be as, a group of ragtag protesters.
They kind of pretend to be, right? But then it's like, well, hang on, they always seem to be at the right place at the right time with the right kid. Give us some colour for what's it like in the room, because obviously the president can, take charge of those things, and they can often go in. We don't need to tell you two that they can often go in a completely random direction and last for hours and hours. He seems quite fired up about this stuff, Rebecca.
Well, there was a lot of really interesting interactions, in my opinion, between the president, the journalists there, and the legacy media that we were standing next to. There you saw a lot of back and forths. One of the reporters, they were commenting about who they thought were the worst outlets, MSNBC, or as the president likes to call them, MSNDC or DNC, and also CNN. Those outlets came up frequently, and when he actually called on the reporters, he asked them which outlets they were with, and if there was an outlet he disliked, or he felt that they didn't cover the issue properly, he would skip.
So he was in transparent, but transparent on his terms.
Exactly.
It is interesting, Reagan. It strikes me, I've only been here for a few months, but it's remarkable. Trump 2.0, 47 versus 45. The ability to this White House in particular has to basically bypass the traditional media. It's great news for you guys. It is a deliberate tactic to basically promote independent and newer voices, which must be sending the networks around the bend, right?
Yes, totally. But also Americans aren't really watching the typical networks to get their news. And the president understands that. And that's really a big reason why his campaign was successful and won in the White House. We didn't see Kamala Harris, harness the podcasts and the new media the way the Trump administration did. And so I think they know that they need to get to these different outlets, these independent voices, to really get the truth out there. And I think one of the great points made by these journalists today at the roundtable was that anybody's a journalist. You can take out your phone.
We've all got iPhones now, yeah.
Press record and put it on Twitter. And a lot of people are tuning into Twitter to just get their news from everyday people who are walking the streets and taking videos. And so that's another way that the Trump administration, with the way that they've invited the new media and social media influencers, are reaching the American people.
Rebecca, how are the old guards of the old media taking it, so to speak?
Well, so I like to kill them with kindness. I like to make friends with everybody, pretty much.
That's the spirit, yeah.
I know. But I mean, I've definitely heard, both of us, I'm sure we can come up with several anecdotes where you can sort of see frustration with a lot of this old guard media who has historically had so much more access than outlets like the Daily Caller or The Blaze. And so it's really been night and day, and you can definitely feel some of that frustration in the briefing room.
Well, let's have a look at some old media that happened overnight. Here is how not to conduct a political interview if you are running to be the governor of California.
The question is, what do you say to the 40% of voters who voted for Trump?
Oh, I'm happy to say that. It's the do you need them to win part that I don't understand. I'm happy to answer the question as you have it written, and I'll answer it.
And we've also asked the other candidates, do you think you need any of those 40% of California voters to win? And you're saying, no, you don't.
No, I'm saying I'm going to try to win every vote I can. And what I'm saying to you is that...
Well, to those voters, okay, so you...
I don't want to keep doing this. I'm going to call it. Okay. Thank you.
You're not going to do the interview with us?
Nope, not like this. I'm not. Not with 7 follow-ups to every single question you ask.
Every other candidate has answered our follow-ups.
I don't care. I want to have a pleasant, positive conversation in which you ask me about every issue on this list. And if every question you're going to make up a follow-up question, then we're never going to get there.
Ms.
And
Porter,
we're just going to circle around.
I am an investigative
I have never
reporter.
had to do this before, ever.
You've never had to have a conversation with
to end an
reporter?
interview.
Okay, but every other candidate has done this.
What part of I'm me? I'm running for governor because I'm a leader. So I am going to make...
So you're not going to answer questions from reporters? Okay, why don't we go through? I will continue to ask follow-up questions because that's my job as a journalist, but I will go through and ask these, and if you don't want to answer, you don't want to answer. So nearly every legislative...
I don't want to have an unhappy experience with you.
California Democrat Katie Porter there. Reagan, a phenomenal way of not going about it. How dare a journalist ask follow-up questions. And my follow-up question is also going to be, are you having a happy experience here on Say I mean, what the hell was that?
I would never.
One of the worst interviews I've ever seen, right?
I would never walk out of the Harry Cole
Oh, well,
show.
I don't know. It's early days. It's early days. Yeah, come on.
Well, can you believe that Katie Porter actually kept going with the interview? She created this whole stink for nothing. And I think it's not only devastating for her, but it's devastating for the whole Democratic Party. It's just another example that they are really off-footing. They do not have a message. They don't know how to handle this time right now and speak to the American people. The fact that this is now bubbling up, it's going viral. I think this clip is pretty old. It's a couple weeks old.
Oh, right, but it's just bubbled up now.
It's going viral.
Massive this morning.
And it's devastating, not just for Katie Porter, but really for the whole Democratic Party.
Rebecca, on that point, every time I seem to see a Democrat pop up on the TV, they're either apologising for making jokes about shooting their political opponents. They're either communists up in New York, or they're AOC making short jokes about people, then having to row back and apologise to the short king community, which just sums up. Reagan's right. They are all over the shop.
No, I mean, I don't casually make jokes about murdering or
exactly.
my political
Call me
rivals,
old-fashioned,
call me old-fashioned. But I really think it speaks to the arrogance of Democrats like Katie Porter. The fact that they can take an interview like this, expect things to just go really smoothly or easily for them. And in the interview, she said that she didn't really feel the need to appeal to the Trump voter, which, although California is a blue state, 40% are Republican voters. The fact that she didn't really even care to win their support or speak to them is really shocking.
It's like they repulsed her. She's like, no, I don't. I wouldn't even go near. I mean, call me old-fashioned. You need to kind of go after.
She's supposed to represent them.
Yeah,
it's crazy. Yeah.
Do you think? Presumably that's. Do you think it's a career-ending interview there?
I definitely don't think it's a good thing for her at all. And I just, on that point that she didn't want to speak to Trump voters, I think that's one thing that the Democratic Party is really struggling with. If you look at the 2024 election, almost every area of the country shifted to the right. If you're a Democrat, you have to be having a moment where you're like, I need to appeal to Trump
even
voters.
Gavin Newsom down in California kind of understands that. He did that podcast with Charlie Kirk, remember, as his first podcast. There are some Democrats that get it, right? Who do you reckon it's going to be?
I don't know. Pete Buttigieg, I know Kamala Harris doesn't like him
because
he's
America's too homophobic.
But he is one of those Democrats who have started to shift to the middle, who has recognized that, being a far left politician isn't in, and that he is going to need to compromise and come a little bit and be less extreme and normal, as I call it, for Americans.
Do you reckon there's an obvious candidate yet emerging?
I mean, I think it's still, the water's still pretty muddy, but to Reagan's point, it's going to be somebody who actually makes an effort to talk to everybody, not just their very niche, increasingly extreme base.
Very good, Rebecca. We've run out of time. We've run out of time to welcome home Terror Goblin Greta Thunberg, who, for an anti-Zionist, so he doesn't half spend a lot of time in Israel being deported. That's all we've got time for tonight. Remember to subscribe. Harry Cole, Save the West. We'll see you tomorrow.